Sandra ran the numbers in March of 2023. She was 56 years old, had been saving for 31 years, and her calculator told her she was on track. She needed $1.4 million. She had $1.38 million. Close enough. Her financial planner called it excellent progress. 2 years later, Sandra sat in the same chair, ran the same numbers, and realized the calculator had been lying to her the whole time. Not because she did anything wrong, because of one assumption buried so deep in the math that almost nobody questions it. 3% annual inflation. That number is in almost every retirement calculator you've ever used. It's baked into most financial planning software, and it was never designed to match what you actually spend money on in retirement. This video is for educational purposes only, not financial advice. Always consult a qualified financial professional before making retirement decisions. Here's where 3% came from. For most of the 20th century, average annual inflation in the United States hovered around 3%. The Consumer Price Index, tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, measured a broad basket of goods: food, clothing, housing, transportation, energy. Over the long run, 3% felt right. It became the default. Planners used it. Software adopted it. And it got passed down like a rule of thumb that nobody ever went back to verify. But here's the problem. The Consumer Price Index measures what the average American buys, and the average American is not a retiree. The basket used to calculate CPI is weighted toward things that working-age adults spend money on: new cars, work clothes, technology, kids' expenses. When you retire, your spending pattern shifts dramatically, and some of the categories that inflate the fastest are exactly the ones retirees spend the most on. Medical costs. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, medical care inflation has averaged closer to 5 to 6% annually over the past 2 decades, not 3. The Milliman Medical Index, which tracks healthcare costs for a typical American family, showed costs rising by roughly 6.4% in 2022 alone. If you're 65 and you need prescription drugs, specialist visits, or any kind of long-term care support, you are not living in a 3% inflation world. You are living in a 5, 6, or even 7% inflation world for those specific line items. And that gap between 3% and 5% doesn't sound like much, but compounded over a 25-year retirement, it is catastrophic. So before we get into exactly how much that gap costs you, drop your answer below. What inflation rate is your retirement calculator using right now? I bet most of you have never actually looked. Let's make this concrete. Say you're planning to spend $60,000 a year in retirement. You use a calculator that assumes 3% inflation. Over 25 years, that calculator says you'll need about $1.4 million to sustain that lifestyle. That's the number Sandra got. That's the number millions of Americans are working toward. Now run the same calculation at 5% inflation for your healthcare and housing costs, which together typically make up more than 50% of a retiree's budget, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey. Your real number doesn't land at $1.4 million. It lands closer to $2.1 million, $700,000. That is the gap between the number your calculator gives you and the number that actually keeps you financially safe. $700,000 that most retirement tools quietly erase because they're using an assumption designed for someone who still drives to work every day. Now here's the mechanism people miss. It's not just that inflation is higher for retirees. It's that your spending doesn't stay flat inside a category. Think about housing. If you own your home outright, your mortgage is gone. But property taxes don't stop. Homeowners insurance keeps rising. And maintenance costs, which the American Association of Retired Persons estimates, average roughly 1 to 4% of a home's value per year. These compound right alongside inflation. If your house is worth $400,000, you could be spending $4,000 to $16,000 a year just keeping it livable, and that number grows every year. Now add healthcare. The Employee Benefit Research Institute published data showing that a 65-year-old couple retiring today may need anywhere from $318,000 to $353,000 saved specifically for healthcare costs alone, not counting long-term care. That's a separate pile of money just for medical expenses, and it inflates faster than nearly anything else in your budget. Here's the second angle most planners skip entirely. Sequence of inflation risk. You've probably heard of sequence of returns risk, the danger that a market crash early in your retirement permanently destroys your portfolio because you're pulling money out while values are down. Sequence of inflation risk works the same way. If inflation spikes hard in the first 5 years of your retirement, which is exactly what happened between 2020 and 2023, you're forced to withdraw more dollars at exactly the moment your portfolio hasn't had time to recover. The two risks compound each other, and a 3% average assumption hides both of them. Sandra didn't just face one bad assumption. She faced 3 overlapping ones. Her calculator used 3% inflation across the board. It didn't model the fact that 61% of her projected spending was in healthcare and housing, the 2 fastest inflating categories. And it assumed inflation would be smooth year to year, not volatile. By 2025, her real adjusted need had crept from $1.4 million to something closer to $1.7 million. That's a $300,000 gap she had no idea existed. If this is changing how you think about your retirement math, that's exactly what this channel is built for. One financial story per week, for people still building wealth, not for people who already have it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, there's a real name for the inflation measure that actually tracks retiree spending. It's called the CPI-E, the Consumer Price Index for the elderly. The Bureau of Labor Statistics developed it as an experimental index, and it consistently runs about 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points higher than the standard CPI on an annual basis. Some years more. That might not sound like much, but over a 30-year retirement, 0.3% compounded adds up to a meaningfully larger required portfolio. And the CPI-E still probably understates healthcare inflation for the oldest retirees, those 80 and above, who use far more medical services than the average 65-year-old. The deeper problem is that most commercial retirement calculators, including the ones built into Fidelity, Vanguard, and Charles Schwab's planning tools, default to the standard CPI or to a fixed 3% input. Some let you change it. Most people never do. The assumption is invisible, and invisible assumptions are the most expensive kind. Here's the framework we'd suggest instead. Stop treating inflation as one number. Break your retirement spending into buckets. Healthcare and long-term care. Plan for 5 to 6% annual inflation on that bucket. Housing costs, including taxes, insurance, and maintenance, plan for 4%. Food and everyday goods, 3% is probably fine. Travel and discretionary spending, 2 to 3%, because you actually spend less on discretionary items as you age into your late 70s and 80s. The research on this is called the Retirement Spending Smile, documented by financial planner Michael Kitces and others, and it shows real-world spending actually dips in the middle retirement years before spiking again in late life due to medical costs. When you model your retirement this way, bucket by bucket with different inflation rates, you stop fighting a single number and start planning for what your life will actually cost. Sandra recalculated using a bucketed approach. Her new target was $1.9 million. Still achievable, but she needed to know the real number to build toward it. The 3% default would have left her short by nearly $500,000, and she would have had no warning until it was too late to fix. Here are 2 things you can do this week. First, go into whatever retirement calculator you use and find the inflation assumption. It's usually buried in the advanced settings. Change it. For healthcare costs specifically, use at least 5%. For housing, use 4%. If the calculator only lets you set one global rate, use 4.5% as your floor, not 3%. The difference in your required savings target will surprise you. Second, look up the CPI-E data directly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. It's public, it's free, and it gives you a more honest picture of what inflation actually looks like for people in or near retirement. Cross-reference it against your own spending categories. If you spend heavily on medical care or prescription drugs, your personal inflation rate is probably running higher than even the CPI-E shows. If you're within 15 years of retirement, some people in this situation also find it useful to ask a fee-only financial planner, specifically one who charges by the hour rather than a percentage of assets, to run a bucketed inflation scenario for their specific portfolio. The National Association of Personal Financial Advisors, NAPFA, keeps a directory of fee-only planners at NAPFA.org. The goal is simple. Stop letting a number that was designed for average working-age Americans quietly define your retirement safety margin. You are not the average. Your spending is not the average. And your retirement plan shouldn't be built on their assumptions. Sandra updated her plan. She's got 8 years left to close the gap. She knows the real number now, and that's the only way to actually hit it. Which brings up the next question almost everyone asks once they fix their inflation assumption: what do you actually invest in to outpace that higher inflation rate inside a retirement account? That breakdown is already on the channel. And one more thing. Now that you know about the 3% trap, what other assumptions in your own retirement plan have you never actually questioned? Drop it below. You might be raising something the whole community needs to hear.